$500 million. That is how much Mark Carney just invested in a railway that makes American ports irrelevant forever. 3,200 miles of track connecting Canadian wheat fields directly to Mexican bakeries without touching a single American port, inspection station, or export terminal. And while Donald Trump threatens annexation and trade wars, Canadian grain is already rolling through his territory to feed Mexican consumers, generating zero revenue for American infrastructure. The shock in Washington is complete. American grain export dominance just evaporated on rails Trump cannot control. Our powerful North American rail network is enhancing safety, competition, and resiliency and expanding route options for Canada's grain shippers. That was Keith Creel, President and CEO of Canadian Pacific Kansas City, standing alongside Mark Carney at a grain terminal in Mexico City, watching Canadian Western red spring wheat arrive after traveling 3,200 miles on a single railroad network that completely bypasses American economic control. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we're showing you how a $31 billion railway merger just rewrote North American trade forever. Why 27 million tons of Canadian grain now bypass American ports completely, and what Mark Carney's railway strategy reveals about the future of continental commerce when America can no longer dictate the terms. Let me tell you about the moment that changed everything. The 14th of April, 2023, Kansas City, Missouri. A ceremonial final spike was driven into railroad track. Not just any merger. Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern officially became CPKC, creating the first single-line railroad linking Canada, the United States and Mexico. $31 billion, years of regulatory battles, Canadian National Railway's competing bid of $33.7 billion defeated by Canadian Pacific's superior vision. What they built is revolutionary. 32,000 kilometers of track, 20,000 miles connecting Calgary to Mexico City, Vancouver to Veracruz, Winnipeg to Monterrey. Every major Canadian grain production region now connected directly to every major Mexican consumption center without requiring a single interchange, handoff, or dependency on American infrastructure. That distinction is critical. Other railroads require handoffs at borders. Each interchange adds delay, cost, and vulnerability to political interference. CPKC is different. Single bill of lading, one railroad, one system. Grain loaded in Saskatchewan arrives in Guadalajara without touching another railroad company, another country's bureaucracy, or another political system's whims. Seamless integration that makes American bottlenecks irrelevant. Mark Carney understood the strategic implications immediately. While Trump threatened tariffs and annexation, Carney quietly supported the infrastructure investment that would make Canadian trade independent of American control. For the 2025 to 2026 crop year, CPKC announced massive expansion, over $500 million Canadian dollars focused specifically on grain transportation capacity. The technical specifications reveal the scale of this transformation. CPKC purchased 5,900 new higher-capacity grain hopper cars. These aren't standard rail cars. They're specially designed for bulk grain transport with larger capacity than previous generations. More efficient loading and unloading, better weather protection, and lower maintenance costs. Plus 100 new Tier 4 diesel, electric locomotives delivered in 2025, representing the latest environmental standards with cleaner burning, more fuel efficiency, and more power to pull longer trains while reducing emissions. Combined with expanded hiring, operational improvements, and network investments, CPKC is delivering transformational capacity gains for Canada's grain supply chain. The numbers prove the revolution is already happening. CPKC expects to conclude the 2024 to 2025 crop year having moved 27 million metric tons of Canadian grain and grain products, the highest volume since 2020 for 2025 to 2026. CPKC plans capacity for up to 685,000 metric tons of Canadian agricultural products each week. When the Port of Thunder Bay operates during summer months, annual capacity reaches 34 million metric tons potential. This isn't theoretical capacity. This is actual infrastructure, actual rail cars, actual locomotives, actual crews ready to move Canadian grain to Mexican markets, while completely bypassing American ports, inspections, and control. The symbolism of Carney and Creel's Mexico City meeting was devastating for American interests. They stood together watching a unit train arrive carrying Canadian Western red spring wheat harvested in Manitoba that had traveled 3,200 miles on CPKC network without ever leaving CPKC track or touching American export infrastructure. Carney toured CPKC raw yard, pointing to national steel car labels on covered hopper cars manufactured in Hamilton, Ontario, Canadian wheat, Canadian rail cars, Canadian railroad, Mexican destination, the United States completely irrelevant to the transaction. A table set up in the rail yard, Carney broke a piece from a bun made at a local Mexico City bakery and said, "This bread could use flour from Canadian wheat." Direct farm to table connection between Canadian farmers and Mexican consumers with no American intermediaries, no American ports, no American inspection regime, just direct bilateral trade. Also present were Anita Anand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Canada, United States Trade. This wasn't a private business deal. This was strategic trade policy using private infrastructure to achieve public goals. Government officials demonstrating that Canada's trade diversification away from American dependence has full political support. Keith Creel explained the strategic shift perfectly. This is just one example of expanded trade options open to Western Canadian grain customers and other exporters looking to diversify end markets amid trade policy uncertainty. Translation: Trump's unpredictability created demand for alternatives to American infrastructure. CPKC built that alternative. Canadian exporters are embracing it enthusiastically because it provides what American routes no longer can. Predictability. Mexico's hunger for Canadian grain makes perfect strategic sense. Population of 130 million with a growing consumer class. Mexico's National Statistics Agency categorizes 1/3 of the population as not poor or vulnerable. That is 42 million middle-class consumers, more than the entire Canadian population, buying bread, pasta, cereal, and tortillas that require grain imports. Mexico produces some grain domestically but not enough to meet demand, traditionally imported from the United States, but Trump's tariff threats and trade unpredictability make America an unreliable supplier. Mexico needs alternatives. Canada offers the solution with premium quality grain that Mexican buyers prefer. Canadian Western red spring wheat has high protein content and excellent baking characteristics that command premium prices. CPKC makes the logistics revolutionary before the merger. Shipping Canadian grain to Mexico required multiple railroads, complex coordination, high costs, and delays at interchanges. Now it is single-line service with one railroad, predictable transit times, competitive pricing, and reliable delivery. Canada even implemented electronic phytosanitary certification in November 2025 specifically to streamline grain exports to Mexico, reducing fraud risk and speeding customs clearance. The result is permanent trade flow redirection. Canadian grain traditionally exported through American ports, Pacific Northwest, Gulf Coast, Great Lakes. Canadian railroads moved grain to American ports where American operators handled exports. American services certified quality, and every step generated American revenue through port fees, inspection charges, stevedore wages, and commissions. That revenue stream just ended. CPKC network bypasses American ports entirely. Canadian grain moves directly to Mexico. American infrastructure goes unused, revenue vanishes. Pacific Northwest ports are especially hurt. While Vancouver and Prince Rupert handle Canadian grain destined for Asia, grain from Mexico no longer flows through Seattle or Portland. Those ports lose traffic, jobs, and economic activity. Gulf Coast ports face similar devastation. Houston, New Orleans, and Mobile traditionally handled Canadian grain exports to Latin America. CPKC makes them irrelevant. Agriculture analysts estimate billions in annual port revenue from Canadian grain exports. A significant portion now bypasses the United States permanently. Here is what makes this bypass legally bulletproof. CPKC trains physically cross American territory. The Manitoba to Mexico City route requires crossing North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Much of that 3,200-mile journey runs through American territory, but the trains don't stop to serve American customers, don't unload at American ports, and don't interact with American export infrastructure. They simply transit like airplanes flying overhead without landing. This is legal under USMCA. The North American Free Trade Agreement explicitly allows cross-border transport. CPKC has absolute legal right to move goods from Canada to Mexico through the United States. Trump cannot block it without violating trade agreements, cannot impose tariffs on transit traffic, cannot restrict railroad operations. Trump's leverage evaporates completely. American crews operate the trains through American territory because that is a regulatory requirement, and CPKC pays those wages. But value captured is minimal compared to full export infrastructure usage. Instead of port operations, inspections, and shipping services, America gets only transit fees while Canada and Mexico capture all the export value. Canadian grain exporters are abandoning American routes because Trump created conditions that make alternatives essential. Constant tariff threats with no predictability make long-term planning impossible. Border enforcement inconsistency means grain shipments face arbitrary delays. Weaponized inspection regimes allow American agricultural inspectors to delay shipments indefinitely by claiming quality concerns. Port congestion deliberately created by Trump policies causes weeks of delays. This chaos makes American infrastructure unreliable. Canadian farmers cannot risk crops on systems that might seize or delay shipments arbitrarily. They need alternatives that provide predictability. CPKC offers exactly that. Direct Canada, Mexico trade that removes American variables. No American border crossings beyond simple transit. No American port operations. No American inspection delays. No American political interference. The competitive advantage is permanent. Canadian National Railway also moves grain but lacks CPKC's Mexico advantage. CN must hand off to American railroads at the border for Mexico delivery, creating interchange vulnerability, delay points, and cost additions. CPKC's competitive advantage is single-line service from Calgary to Mexico City with no interchange and no delays. Together, CN and CPKC move over 55 million metric tons of Canadian grain annually and control the logistics that decide routing. Both see Mexico as a growth market. Both are investing in capacity. Both benefit from Trump creating demand for American bypass routes. Competition drives efficiency while Canadian farmers and Mexican consumers benefit, and American ports lose. This infrastructure represents permanent change. The $500 million in hopper cars and locomotives will serve Canada, Mexico grain trade. Until 2055, rail cars last 30 to 40 years. Locomotives have similar lifespans. This equipment will operate long after Trump, long after current governments, creating permanent physical reality that cannot be easily reversed. Track infrastructure is even more durable. Rail lines laid in the 1800s remain in use today, maintained and upgraded but fundamentally the same network. CPKC's 32,000 kilometers of track will serve North American trade for a century or more. Cannot be torn up, cannot be redirected, connects Canada and Mexico permanently regardless of American policy preferences. Customer relationships are equally sticky. Once Mexican buyers establish purchasing relationships with Canadian suppliers via CPKC, they continue because they know product quality, trust delivery, reliability, understand pricing, and have built relationships with Canadian grain companies. They don't switch back to American suppliers without compelling reasons. Similarly, Canadian farmers who shift to the Mexican market stay there because they found reliable customers, receive fair prices, and get paid on time. No incentive exists to return to American markets that proved unreliable during Trump's trade chaos. Labor and expertise follow the infrastructure. CPKC hired crews, trained them on Mexico routes, built expertise in cross-border operations, and developed relationships with Mexican customers. This human capital cannot be quickly replicated and provides lasting competitive advantage that extends far beyond current political leadership. The infrastructure creates permanent facts on the ground. Canada and Mexico are now directly connected by world-class freight railroad that will function regardless of American policy, regardless of Trump's tariffs, regardless of American preferences. Trump cannot change it, cannot stop it, and has zero leverage over it. Trump assumed American infrastructure was indispensable, assumed Canadian grain must flow through American ports, assumed American inspection regimes were unavoidable, assumed American shipping companies were necessary for global trade. Every assumption was wrong. CPKC proved Canadian grain can reach major markets without American involvement. Mexico represents 130 million consumers with growing middle-class demand, and Canadian wheat arrives directly via CPKC. Trump's tariff threats become meaningless because they cannot threaten Canadian grain exports that don't flow through American infrastructure, cannot impose port fees on ports that aren't used, cannot weaponize inspections that aren't required, cannot delay shipments that don't touch American systems. The annexation rhetoric backfires completely. Instead of forcing Canadian compliance, Trump pushed Canada to build independence. Instead of increasing American leverage, he eliminated it. Instead of making Canada more dependent, he made Canada more autonomous. Every Trump threat strengthened the case for CPKC investment. Every tariff announcement drove more Canadian exporters to explore Mexican markets. Every unpredictable policy shift reinforced the value of American bypass routes. From Canada's perspective, this represents liberation, no longer hostage to American policy whims, no longer dependent on American ports, no longer vulnerable to arbitrary tariffs. Canada has alternatives, infrastructure to reach them, and customers who want the product. Trump's leverage has been eliminated completely. The $500 million CPKC investment transforms North American trade geography permanently. Canadian grain flows directly to Mexican consumers, while generating zero revenue for American infrastructure. Trump's strategy of dividing and conquering North American allies through economic pressure has failed catastrophically, creating exactly the independence he tried to prevent. And the trains keep rolling, carrying Canadian wheat to Mexican bakeries. 3,200 miles of track that proves American dominance isn't as permanent as Washington assumed.